The European Union is the world's second largest economy. It has a currency that rivals the US dollar, its own flag, its own parliament, and a powerful court system. EU regulations often set global standards for trade, technology, and environmental protection. But it's not a country, it's not a federation, and it's far more than just a trade agreement. It has no president, no unified army, and it's facing serious internal divisions and a growing political backlash. The EU may be one of the most powerful and most confusing actors in international relations today. So, what exactly is it, and why have 27 states voluntarily given up part of their sovereignty and their national authority to be a part of it? In this video, we're going to trace the European Union's origins, institutions, and ambitions. And we'll ask, is it a model for peaceful cooperation or a fragile experiment under pressure? To understand the European Union, we have to start with its deeper purpose, and that begins in the ashes of World War II. In just 3 decades, Europe had experienced 2 catastrophic wars, both centered on Western Europe and both fueled by nationalism, economic instability, and the failure of cooperation. After 1945, European leaders knew that avoiding a third war would require more than diplomacy. They needed a structure that would bind national interests together. Enter French Foreign Minister Robert Schuman. Often called the father of Europe, Schuman was a member of the French resistance to German occupation during World War II, and after the war became the Prime Minister and later the Foreign Minister of France. He was also one of the first people to envision a supranational Europe. In a speech in Strasbourg on May 16, 1949, Schuman argued that we are carrying out a great experiment, the fulfillment of the same recurrent dream that for 10 centuries has revisited the peoples of Europe, creating between them an organization putting an end to war and guaranteeing an eternal peace. The European spirit signifies being conscious of belonging to a cultural family and to have a willingness to serve that community in the spirit of total mutuality, without any hidden motives of hegemony or the selfish exploitation of others. Our century, that has witnessed the catastrophes resulting from unending clashes of nationalities and nationalisms, must attempt and succeed in reconciling nations in a supranational association. This would safeguard the diversities and aspirations of each nation while coordinating them in the same manner as the regions are coordinated within the unity of the nation. Schumann's vision became the European Coal and Steel Community, the ECSC, established in 1951 by 6 states: France, West Germany, Italy, Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg. The European Coal and Steel Community had 2 primary purposes, one economic and the other political. Economically, the ECSC established a free trade area for coal, steel, and related sectors. But it was more than a simple free trade agreement. It levied a common tax on steel, improved working conditions, and critically, placed the raw material of war under shared control. Perhaps more importantly, though, the ECSC had a key political objective, the establishment of a framework for German-French reconciliation after the war. By tying coal and steel, 2 of the primary commodities needed for military construction and conflict, into a single European-wide governance structure, the founders of the ECSC were making an important symbolic statement while also increasing the potential cost of war between the countries. This was functionalism in action. Start small, focus on technical cooperation, and let trust grow. And the plan worked. In 1957, the same 6 countries signed the Treaties of Rome, creating the European Economic Community, the EEC, and Euratom. Economically, the EEC built a common market and customs union. Politically, it laid the groundwork for deeper integration and macroeconomic coordination. In this sense, it also represented the first steps towards the creation of the European Common Market, all key features of the European Union today. In 1965, the functions of the European Economic Community were expanded through the Treaty of Brussels, also known as the Merger Treaty. As the name suggests, the Merger Treaty merged 3 separate institutions: the European Coal and Steel Community, the European Atomic Energy Community, and the European Economic Community under the single umbrella organization, the EEC. Over time, new countries joined: Denmark, Ireland, and the United Kingdom in 1973, Greece in 1981, Spain and Portugal in 1986, bringing the total membership of the organization to 12. In 1986, the Single European Act was adopted. The act aimed to tackle Eurosclerosis, the economic slowdown in Europe at the time, by promoting further economic integration. The act also expanded the powers of the community and introduced qualified majority voting in some areas, a significant move away from the historical practice of decisions based on consensus. These changes reflected the neofunctionalist spillover. As integration deepened in one area, pressure grew to integrate in others. The 1990s and early 2000s represented the heyday of progress towards union. Membership in the Union rapidly expanded, first in the 1990s to include most of Western Europe, and then in the early 2000s as the former Soviet bloc states of Eastern Europe joined. In 1995, Austria, Finland, and Sweden joined. In 2004, 10 new states joined: Cyprus, the Czech Republic, Estonia, Hungary, Latvia, Lithuania, Malta, Poland, Slovakia, and Slovenia. And in 2007, Bulgaria and Romania joined, bringing the total membership in the organization to 27 states. During this same period, the roles and powers of the European Union were also being expanded. In February 1992, the Maastricht Treaty, more formally known as the Treaty on the European Union, was adopted. The Maastricht Treaty officially created the European Union and established its three pillars in which the relative powers of the European Union and its member states were divided. The first pillar was comprised largely of economic issues, encompassing areas ranging from customs union, agricultural policy, economic and monetary union, consumer protection, environmental law and social policy, and others. Under the first pillar, community integration was greatest and the powers of the EU and the idea of supranational governance was strongest. The second pillar was common foreign and security policy. This included items like human rights, democracy and foreign aid, defense policy, and peacekeeping. Here, the emphasis was placed on coordination under the European Union, recognizing that individual member states may also have policies they wish to pursue. The third pillar centered on policy and judicial cooperation and included areas like drug policy, human and weapons trafficking, terrorism, and organized crime. As with the second pillar, policymaking here was largely at the intergovernmental level, with member states cooperating through the institutions of the European Union in pursuit of specific policy aims. The Maastricht Treaty also provided for the establishment of the monetary union and the creation of the euro, the official currency of 20 of the 27 European Union member states. Successive treaties expanded and refined EU powers. The Treaty of Amsterdam of 1997 strengthened the European Parliament and moved immigration and civil law to EU control. It also emphasized the idea of subsidiarity, the idea that decisions should be made at the level of governance closest to the people. The Treaty of Nice of 2001 reformed voting rules, retaining the requirement of a majority of states to support policies, but adding a second requirement that those states represent a majority of the EU population. This system became known as the double majority requirement. The qualified majority voting system is intended to ensure that a coalition of small states cannot gang up on and force their will on more populous states, and that a small group of large states cannot block the will of the body. On a handful of sensitive issues like tax policy, immigration, and foreign policy, the Council requires unanimity. In practice, though, the vast majority of decisions of the Council are made on the basis of consensus, without a formal vote ever being taken. The Nice Treaty also set the stage for the European Union's expansion into Eastern Europe. The Treaty of Lisbon of 2009 replaced the pillar structure with a system of exclusive, shared, and supporting competencies, which clarified the division of decision-making authority between the EU and its members. It also gave the EU a legal personality, granting it the authority to participate in international organizations as an independent actor separate from the participation of its member states. And it expanded the powers of the European Parliament, including granting it the power to manage the budget. Since the early 2000s, progress towards integration has stalled, particularly as far-right nationalists and Eurosceptic parties have garnered increasing representation in the European Parliament. In July 2013, Croatia became the 28th member of the European Union. While there are still several states in the process of joining, called candidate members, none have received approval for their membership in the Union. Britain completed its withdrawal, process known as Brexit, in 2020, making it the only country to ever withdraw from the Union and bringing the EU to its current 27 members. Currently, there are 9 candidate members: Albania, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Georgia, Moldova, Montenegro, North Macedonia, Serbia, Turkey, and Ukraine. Kosovo has also submitted its application for candidate status. So, what exactly are the requirements for membership? Put simply, candidate members must comply with all EU standards and rules, they must have the consent of the EU institutions and member states to join, and their membership must be approved by their citizens, either through approval by national parliament or by popular referendum. To be eligible for membership, countries must meet the so-called Copenhagen criteria, outlined by the European Council in 1993. These include 3 specific criteria: stable institutions guaranteeing democracy, the rule of law, protection of human rights, and respect for and protection of minority groups, a functioning market economy and the capacity to cope with competition and market forces in the European Union, and the ability to take on and effectively implement the obligations of membership, including adherence to the aims of the political, economic, and monetary union. So what began as a narrow coal and steel agreement between 6 countries evolved into a 27-member union, a sprawling political, legal, and economic system that touches on everything from banking to environmental law to data privacy. It's a story of gradual expansion, often driven by necessity, and pushed forward by what neofunctionalists call a spillover: cooperation in one area, creating pressure to cooperate in others. Each new crisis, whether economic, geopolitical, or social, prompted new forms of collaboration, new institutions, and new powers at the EU level. The EU's institutional system blends intergovernmental and supranational elements. The European Council is comprised of the heads of state or government of the members of the European Union. In theory, the Council represents the interests of the member states while providing direction and guidance to the EU. The European Council provides direct guidance to the Council of the European Union, which is comprised of 27 ministers, 1 per member state, with portfolios relevant to the issue under consideration. Because of this, and to avoid confusion with the European Council, it's sometimes referred to as the Council of Ministers. Thus, if the Council is addressing questions of foreign policy, the foreign ministers will be represented. If it's debating agricultural policy, the ministers of agriculture will be present, and so on. The Council is supposed to ensure broad coordination of economic and social policy across the European Union. The Council also shares some budgetary and legislative powers with the European Parliament through a process called co-decision. The European Parliament is the legislature of the European Union. It shares authority with the Council of Ministers while simultaneously representing the people of Europe in the European Union. It has the power to approve, reject, or amend legislative proposals brought to it by the Commission, but it does not have the power to draft legislation itself, unusual for a parliament. The Parliament also approves appointments to the European Commission, approves the EU budget, and carries out oversight responsibilities. The Parliament itself is comprised of 720 members, elected to 5-year terms on a national basis through a system of proportional representation. Importantly, while the number of seats is assigned on the basis of population and the largest countries of the European Union have the most seats, the actual distribution of seats is based on a system of digressive proportionality, meaning that the smallest states are overrepresented in Parliament relative to the largest states. Once elected, members of the European Parliament sort themselves into groups based on party identity rather than national identity. Thus, members of the national political parties sort themselves into a series of groups based on the party's ideological and policy preferences. The largest of these include the European People's Party Group, the Progressive Alliance of Socialists and Democrats, the Patriots of Europe, the European Conservatives and Reformist Group, Renew Europe, the Greens, and others. The European Commission serves as the executive branch of the European Union. Headed by the President of the European Commission, the Commission has long been the primary proponent of Europe, going so far as to push member states towards greater integration. The European Commission is comprised of 27 commissioners, 1 per member state. Commissioners take an oath to the European Union rather than to their home state. The European Commission submits draft legislation to the Parliament and Council for consideration, implements policies, administers the budget, and negotiates international agreements on behalf of the Union. Historically the center of power in the European Union, the Treaty of Lisbon took some steps towards limiting the power of the Commission. That said, it arguably remains the most powerful actor in the European Union. The functional work of the European Union is undertaken by a number of director generals who are career civil servants with expertise in relevant policy areas. Each director general reports to a commissioner who oversees a directorate general or DG. In total, there are some 32,000 professional civil servants working in the various DGs. This is where the actual work of the Commission is done. The European Court of Justice, formerly known as the Court of Justice of the European Union, is based in Luxembourg and is supposed to ensure the uniform application of justice and interpretation of law across the European Union. The ECJ has the power to hear disputes involving member states or European institutions, as well as disputes between institutions, businesses, and individuals in the European Union. Unlike many international courts, the ECJ has compulsory jurisdiction, meaning that its decisions are binding on the member states of the EU. It's also considered a court of last resort, meaning it can hear appeals from national courts involving principles or obligations under European law. Finally, the European Central Bank, or ECB, is headquartered in Frankfurt and works with the national central banks to determine monetary policy in the Eurozone. Unlike the Federal Reserve Bank in the United States, which has a twin mission of maintaining price stability or preventing inflation and ensuring full employment, or at least low rates of unemployment, the ECB's mission includes only price stability. There are also a number of specialized agencies operating under the auspices of the European Union. These include Europol, the European Police and Law Enforcement Agency, which coordinates the activities of member states, the Committee on Regions, which is comprised of elected representatives from distinct regions inside Europe and advises the EU on issues of concern to the regions, and the European Space Agency, and others. For all its complexity and controversy, the European Union has produced some remarkable outcomes. These achievements help explain why, despite persistent challenges, many countries have been eager to join and hesitant to leave. First and foremost is the single market. This allows for the free movement of goods, services, capital, and people across most of the EU, a level of economic integration unmatched by any other regional bloc. What does this mean in practice? A company in Spain can sell its products in Denmark without tariffs. A Polish citizen can move to Ireland to work or study without needing a visa. And banks or investors can operate across borders with minimal restrictions. Second, the euro, the European Union's common currency. Adopted by 20 of the 27 member states, it's become one of the world's most traded currencies, second only to the US dollar. The euro simplifies trade and travel, eliminates exchange risk among members, and helps deepen financial integration across the eurozone. Third, the Schengen Area, a zone of open borders among 27 European countries, including all EU members except Bulgaria, the Czech Republic, Denmark, Hungary, Poland, Romania, and Sweden, plus Iceland, Liechtenstein, Norway, and Switzerland, which are not EU member states, but which nevertheless use the euro as their official currency. Travelers can cross from France to Germany to the Netherlands without showing a passport once. This is one of the most popular and visible signs of integration for everyday Europeans. Programs like Erasmus allow students to study abroad across the EU with funding and credit recognition. Millions of young Europeans have grown up seeing their neighbors not as foreigners but as classmates and colleagues. The EU is also a regulatory superpower. Its standards for product safety, data privacy, think the GDPR, environmental protection, and food labeling often become global norms because companies would rather comply with EU rules than lose access to its huge market. In this way, the EU influences international relations not through military power, but through market power and legal standards. So, while the EU may lack the hard power of a traditional superpower, it has built one of the world's largest, most integrated economies, created tools for cooperation and mobility that touch the lives of hundreds of millions of people every day, and extends its influence through regulatory and diplomatic efforts. Perhaps the EU's most significant and often overlooked achievement is this. Since its founding, there have been no wars between its member states. In a region that for centuries was the epicenter of global conflict, this is no small feat. The EU has helped transform relationships between historic enemies, especially France and Germany, through deep economic ties, shared political institutions, and a common legal framework. Integration hasn't made war just undesirable, it's made it logically and politically unthinkable. The EU is thus a textbook example of a security community, a group of states so interconnected that the use of force between them becomes no longer a viable option. In that sense, the EU's success isn't measured by trade flows or GDP, it's measured by the sustained peace that it's helped maintain. But these successes haven't come without growing pains. For all its achievements, the European Union has never been free from controversy, and in recent years it's faced some of the most serious challenges in its history. One of the most common criticisms of the EU is what scholars and citizens alike call the democratic deficit. While the EU has elected bodies like the European Parliament, many of its most powerful institutions, like the European Commission and the European Central Bank, are either unelected or only indirectly accountable to voters. For many Europeans, this raises a troubling question: who's making decisions in Brussels and how can we influence them? While the introduction of the euro brought many benefits, it's also exposed deep economic divides between member states. During the Eurozone debt crisis in the early 2010s, countries like Greece, Italy, and Spain faced soaring debt and unemployment, while wealthier states like Germany and the Netherlands pushed for fiscal austerity and discipline. The result was rising resentment, social unrest, and a perception, especially in the South, that EU rules benefit some member states more than others. In 2015, the EU faced a massive influx of refugees fleeing war and instability in Syria, Afghanistan, and North Africa. While the EU attempted to coordinate a response, national governments disagreed sharply over how to share the responsibility. One key source of tension during the EU migration crisis was the Dublin Regulation, a policy that requires asylum seekers to apply for protection in the first EU country they enter. In theory, this was meant to streamline the asylum process and prevent people from submitting multiple claims in different countries. But in practice, it placed disproportionate pressure on border countries like Greece, Italy, and Spain, states that were already struggling with economic hardship. Meanwhile, wealthier northern countries often avoided frontline responsibility. And as the number of arrivals surged in 2015, this imbalance provoked deep frustration and division within the EU, with some states calling for greater burden sharing and others rejecting mandatory quotas altogether. This crisis exposed the limits of solidarity and the challenge of building a shared migration policy in a system still rooted in national control. Each of these challenges revealed something important about the EU. Integration is not a linear path. It's contested, it generates winners and losers, and it constantly forces a negotiation between shared governance and national autonomy. In theory, regional integration builds peace and prosperity, but in practice, it also raises difficult questions. How much sovereignty are states really willing to give up, and how much unity can be built across such a diverse continent? So, what should we make of the European Union? Is it the most successful experiment in international cooperation the world has ever seen? Or is it a fragile system constantly on the edge of crisis? There's no doubt that the EU has achieved things once thought impossible: binding former enemies in a peace, creating a borderless zone for free movement, and setting global standards in trade, technology, and environmental regulation. It's also served as inspiration, or at least as a reference point, for other regional projects, from the African Union's continental frameworks to ASEAN's efforts at economic cooperation and security dialogue. But the EU is also a reminder that integration isn't easy, especially when it touches on sensitive areas like identity, borders, and economic redistribution. The crises of the past decade, from the Eurozone meltdown to the migration crisis to Brexit, have exposed real limits as to what states are willing to give up in pursuit of shared governance. In many ways, the EU shows both the promise and the peril of regional integration, its ability to solve problems that transcend borders, and the backlash that can follow when the people feel that those solutions are imposed from above. So is the European Union a model to follow, or a warning to proceed with caution? The answer may depend on your perspective. Either way, it challenges us to think differently about sovereignty, cooperation, and regional power and what that can look like in a globalized world.